Alright, so this is going to be a quick walkthrough of the Web API endpoints or web services feature that we've added new to 2.6. So the first thing you'll notice here is I've created two apps here. Typically when you create app suites that are built around this web service, the idea is you're going to have at least two apps. That's kind of the point. It lets you separate out some of the concerns. So what we're going to start with here is looking at the service app here. Right now this is initially empty. I haven't done anything to this app yet other than create it here. But what I'm going to want to do if I want to have a web service on this app is I scroll down here in the app drawer to the Web API endpoints here. What I'm going to do is add a Web API endpoint. I can give it a name. It can be something descriptive, whatever I want. Perhaps get value. Alright, now I can give it a path down here. The path doesn't have to exactly match the name, but in this case let's make it getValue.json. What that's actually going to do is that's going to, well, first I have to create here. So once I've created that, I'm going to have to expand it and click edit. And at this point you see here I have HTTP verbs here I can use. So I can use the get, post, or put actions. And what that's going to do when I do that is it's going to essentially expose a URL on this app. So if I was to deploy this app at service, there would be a URL exposed at service/API/getValue.json. That will be exposed for specifically whichever verb I choose to use here. So this is just getting data. We're not going to modify anything, so let's just go ahead and do it as a get action. So now you see here what I have is I have our standard sort of action chain editor here where I can add new actions. It only supports a subset of the actions that airSpring supports, but there's quite a few things in here. You have a custom function, you have trigger a component event, you have send an email message, you have the ability to read an input data set, write an output data set, create a PDF, or queue a PDF. In this case, let's just actually first for fun here, let's show how you might, let's create a value here that we can return on this form. So we're going to go ahead and add a text box here, and we're going to initialize its value to test value 1. And then we're going to come over here back down to our endpoint, and on this get here we're going to go ahead and do a custom function. And we're going to use that input I added and map that into our custom function here. And all we're going to do, this is going to be a really simple function. We're just going to call airComplete, which tells us that our function's done. We're going to pass it a null, meaning there were no errors, and then we're going to return a JSON object here. And we're just going to have a single key in this JSON object. It's going to be value, and it's going to return the value of our text input here. Go ahead and save all those changes. Just make sure my view is saved too. Okay, so that is the service side. Now then, if we actually want to make use of that, we're going to need to call it over here in our UI app. So I'm just going to edit this view real quick, and let's just do this quick and dirty. We're just going to create a button here and a text input. Assuming I can, there we go. And our button is just going to call that web service in our second app. So to do that at this point, we have to use a custom function. And I've got kind of a little template over here you can use for how to do this exactly. So basically, you can use jQuery here, and you need to make the appropriate request to the other app. So in this case, that app, I'm assuming we're going to deploy it at /service, and of course, as always, it's going to be behind API, and then we called it getValue.json. So this is going to make this request for us, and when it's done, we're going to get a response back, assuming it succeeds. It's always good to have this fail condition down here, though, in case it doesn't, and to check the response status to make sure it's set to OK. So let's see here. So in this case, on our response object, we just returned value. So this response should have value in it, which should be that value that we returned in our JSON. And we're just going to display that in our text box here. And you'll notice here I'm calling airComplete. This is necessary in this case because this custom function is asynchronous. I'm using jQuery here to make this web request. If you have an asynchronous function like this in airSpring, especially if you're updating values, it's very important that you manually call airComplete so that we know when your function's actually done executing. Otherwise, you might run into errors and you might find that values that you think you're updating may not get updated properly. So we'll go ahead and save this. Okay, so now that we've deployed the apps, you'll see here I've deployed to Service and Web UI. We're going to launch the Web UI app. And if we click this button here, we should see there that test value 1 has populated as it has. And so what happened there was that this actually called across to our service app, and our service app pulled the value out of that text box on its form and returned it to here. So now I'm going to show real quickly how you might set some data. So we showed how to get a piece of data out of that form. Now let's edit our web API endpoint again. Perhaps this should have been called value.json. And if I wanted to change that path, I can now just edit it right here. So this is now going to be called value.json. And I'm going to define a post action to go with our get action. And this post action is again just going to be a custom function. We'll call it custom set value. And it's going to be basically the reverse of the function we just created. We're going to again pull in this test value, but this time we're going to set a value here, and we're going to take it off of our reduction. The reduction is kind of a magical object we create for you. Normally in an action chain it represents data that was passed along from the previous action. In the case of a web API endpoint like this, the first action in the chain is going to receive values that were in the post body or the query string parameters on the reduction. So in this case, we're going to assume that our client is going to send us a value, an attribute called value on the reduction. And so we'll just set that to there. And then for good measure, we're going to go ahead and call airComplete ourselves again so that we can pass back a JSON message indicating success. So we'll just give it a single attribute here called status, and we'll say OK. So we'll save that. And now we need to go over here and edit our UI app. Before I forget, I'm just going to update this original button here and change this to call get on value.json. Point out a quick correction here. Earlier I told you to check response.status here, but that was actually not necessary in this case because this response is not going to have a status attribute on there. We didn't set that on it. All it has is value. So really you just want to check that response exists. As long as it exists, in this case, that's what we're expecting to get back from the service. So save that. And now let's just go ahead and add a new button here. For the sake of making this not terribly ugly, let's move it down. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy what we have in this action, because we're going to do something very similar over here in this button. So again, custom, and this time we're going to change this get to a post, but it should be going to the same URL there. We also need to pull in real quick, we're going to add some data to this that we're going to post. So this time we're just going to create an object for this post like so, and we're going to go ahead and map it to this new input we created. So we're going to take whatever we type there, we're going to stick it in this object with the value attribute, and we're just going to pass that along in our post body like so. And then this time we are going to check for a response of OK. So response.status equal OK. And in that case, I think we're going to want to just display to ourselves somehow that this worked. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to add another label here real quick. Let's see what this is complaining about. Oh, here we go. So just to make this simple, we'll just add another text box here. And we'll call it done. And over here, assuming we get back OK, we're just going to set this text box value to success. Okay, so I've now redeployed these two apps and I've reloaded the page, so let's just see if this worked. Let's call this value2 edited. And we saw our success here, so that should mean that that form was updated. So let's try our original request again. And as you see, it now pulled back our new value. And real quick, I just want to mention, if you're looking for some other samples of this sort of thing, a good place to look if you're an airSpring developer is to actually look in our tests. So if you look under your AirStep folder under tests, Nightwatch, resources, web API endpoints, you're going to see these two ASRs here, web API test service and web API test app UI. I've already imported these here. What you'll see here is these are what we use in our Nightwatch specs, and they provide a pretty full range of examples for all these different types of services, making use of all the actions we support. So there is a form values one, which does essentially what I just demonstrated. There is a get file data endpoint, which uses a file data source to return JSON data from a file. There is an SQL query one, which uses an SQLite database, and that service lets you do queries against that. If you look at that real quick, there's a post action for writing to an output data set, and you'll see basically what we do here is we first set the value that comes in our reduction, in this case name, to a form, to a text box on the form, and we are then able to map that in our output query. So we have this output data set that we run here, and if you were to look at that data set, you'd see that it's constructing a query with that input box mapped into it, so that's going to do an update. And same concept here with our reading. A neat thing you can do here for returning data from a input data set is that it will actually give back the data set that's returned from the query on the reduction. So you can put a custom function there right after you do your read, and you can extract, say in this case we are querying for a table called or updating a data set rather called Light People DS. So I can pull that data set out and I can return that through airComplete. So the application that calls this service is going to get that data set in its JSON callback. Real quick here, look over here at the corresponding UI. And again, we just use this for testing, but it's a great place to look at the examples. So we have lots of buttons around here that call these various things, and for the most part update a response in this window here. There's a few things down here. This is the one for updating the form that I mentioned. This inserts a new person into an SQLite database. Here we can request the file data, query the SQLite database to see what its current state is, request the current form data. This checks that the data set is being updated when we write. So this basically gives you a count of the number of people that are currently in the database. This is more just for testing. This just increments a value and keeps track of it and gets that count back. This tests sending an email, which is another supported action. And this tests generating a PDF, and that PDF is going to return back the URL where it's stored after it's done generating and set it right here. And you can click that to launch the PDF.